Hi everyone, welcome to week 11. I want to begin by thanking you for some of the risks that you've been taking in your writing. Some of the posts from last week were really inspiring, and it was really refreshing to see how you've been taking up this challenge of thinking poetically, thinking ephemerally, as you imagined identity beyond the confines of common assumptions. So this week we'll be carrying with us those orientations to thinking and writing as we think about care. So this week in our readings, Bellicasa writes that to care for something or for somebody is inevitably to create a relation. So it's a labor beyond the self to hold and sustain interdependencies in the worlds in which we live, worlds that are often composed of normative violences. And as Tom Van Duren suggests in this week's video clip, care and ethical engagements in caring practices requires an active and ongoing interrogation and critique of the terms in which we come to care. So he draws on Donna Haraway in proposing that we must notice and investigate how it is that we become subject to another, how we arrive in moments of an encounter with another, and what kinds of epistemological orientations frame our caring acts. So in other words, how do our ways of thinking create how it is that we're able to meet another and care for them? So he thinks with Bellicasa and Haraway in proposing that care itself is a vital practice of critique, not only critiquing for critique's sake or only deconstructing, only unpacking something and then leaving all of the pieces, but also using this critique to propose something. That an action must always happen in relation with others in a way that's situated within a way of seeing that's critical, that's thoughtful, and that's engaged and committed and thinking otherwise. So he's proposing that thinking is integral in doing things differently. Thinking has consequences, and our ways of doing things has consequences, and thus our effects, there are particular effects in our ways of caring for others, that despite sometimes good intentions of care, violent effects may take shape. And in one of the articles this week, it's discussed that the ongoing colonial legacies via social services, and in our context, education, is one example of how these acts of care via schooling, without critique and without thought, might perpetuate oppression, and that these violences upon others become that these can create violences upon others that go unnoticed, that become possible because we rely only on common sense. So, for example, there are reasons why 48% of children in care of the Ministry of Children and Families are Indigenous children. As early childhood educators, we work within colonial structures that in many ways perpetuate the possibility for these truths to go on. So thinking with the article this week by Defini, Palacios, Musina, and Chadwick, as early childhood educators, how might acts of care contribute to these inequities, might contribute to these violences? How might educational care be unwittingly oppressive via the very structures that guide its caring practices? And this is a key question that we'll be thinking this week in the forums. So in this sense, caring is not straightforward. Bellicasa warns that care cannot fall into an idealized nostalgia, that it's smooth, seamless, romantically easy, or comforting. She suggests that care is an act of interdeterminacy, building relations with others across difference, which inherently means that these relations are already troubled from the moment that they begin. So she thinks about care here in an ontological sense, how care might exist and live in the world, rather than locating care as an individual moral choice. Here, care is not a concept that exists within the self or only even within the human but rather care is a lived phenomenon that exists in relations with others. So as we discussed last week, our identities and ways of being are continually formed and reformed in relation with others. So then the way that we meet another, the ways in which we relate and perhaps then care are also continually formed and reformed. So thus our ethics of caring can never be fixed or stable. And this notion that care is eternally becoming proposes important conversations about ethical policies and the ways in which we work within institutions, how care is often taken up within early childhood contexts. So Belcasa writes that identity forms are shaped by the demanding aspects of relation and by positionality situated in different times and spaces. As we discussed last week, these positions are not static. Who we are is continually in response to our to our contextual relations, our times and places. So then there are problems and perhaps violences at play in trying to confine identities within fixed terms that don't honor these contextual lived relations. Within the colonial structures of the school, our methods of knowledge building are often grounded in these fixed terms and inform the methods that we use and gather meaning. So these structures are actively working not only within the normative structures of education, but also in our minds, how we come to know what we know. And they predetermine what can be thought and what can be said. So these methods are very much alive in research practices, which provide the groundwork for what's considered good or quality early childhood education practices, and thus what constitutes ethical caring practices. Yet if we view identities as in flux, as becoming, as movement that exists beyond these solidified methods and knowledges, we can see how these methods and structures of caring might be tensioned and perhaps even unethical. So I'd like to read Susan's post from last week to support our understanding of identity beyond categorical thought and predetermined knowledges, and also to highlight how our ways of seeing, how our methods of coming to know something and of studying and also of teaching might unconsciously enact violence. So Susan writes, in the process of changing from a caterpillar to a butterfly, the caterpillar in the cocoon turns into a sort of goo. Scientists have found that the goo retains memories from the caterpillar's life, and the butterfly acquires those memories. The goo is neither a butterfly nor a caterpillar, but somehow it is both. My identity is a goo that is made up of all of my memories and lived experiences. Researchers came to study my identity. They extracted my goo from my body and took it to the laboratory. What is the shape of goo? They asked. But my goo took the shape of any container they put it in. What is the color of goo? They asked. But my goo was every color and no color at all. Each researcher saw a different color, and they couldn't agree on one. What does it smell like? The researchers sniffed my goo. Hope, said one researcher. Disappointment, said another. Frustrated, the researchers put my goo in the freezer overnight. When they returned the next morning, the goo was solid. As they carried it from the freezer, their warm hands melted the goo into a liquid again. They put the goo in a Bunsen burner and heated it up. The vapor from my goo went into the researchers' noses and lungs. It dispersed throughout the room, into the ventilation system, and then out into the world. They didn't have the language to describe my goo. They took what was left of my goo and gave it back to me. They poured it back into my body, but as the goo took the form of its vessel again, it no longer filled it. So this piece speaks to me, I think, about the unknowability of identities and the violences at play in trying to wholly know identity, and perhaps the kinds of orientations and dispositions that might be necessary in order to care for and honor identities as becoming. that goo is not empty in its fluidity, but rather it holds memories and lived experiences that push past the boundaries of categorical thought, and if cared for, in the midst of its movement and ephemerality, might carry these memories and experiences into new forms. A continuity of its history and place might become possible. So, lives that are able to carry with them their histories and become with others without the violences of extractive, fragmented logics and methods. So, I'm thinking with Susan's story in order to question how caring for others, not only for children, but also for more than human others, for example, animals, plants, land, even plastics, waste materials, the beings of place whose actions co-constitute the worlds in which we live, might be imagined as a process of becoming, as lived, as a doing that doesn't exist outside of the performative natures of these beings, but with and in the world in motion. So importantly, I'm thinking with her story to imagine the kind of thinking that might be necessary to notice the violence in seemingly ordinary methods, the kind of thinking that might be situated in the midst of goo, not to wholly know the goo, but to be with, to notice, to be curious, and to be affected by the goo. So, as we've discussed a lot in this course, this world in motion is not neutral or innocent. It's teased up in colonial discourses of gendered and racialized performativities. It's not free or liberatory, and thus, how can we imagine care within the thickness of this world by being informed by its perfections and contradictions? So David Jardine writes that in order to know the world, we need to love it. Yet I'll add that this love is not a love that grows out of only happy, blissful moments. This is a difficult love. And in order to hold on to and to sustain this love and care over time, we have to stay with the trouble, as Haraway would say, and to situate care in the midst of discomfort, to care in spaces of difference and incommensurability. So this view of care moves radically beyond neoliberal propositions of the individualized self. It challenges the all too familiar idea that I only care for myself, for my biological family, for my personal growth, to a redistributed sense of collective care and kinship that notices interdeterminacies and relations beyond ourselves, that exists in movement with others, and that it pays attention to how we affect and are affected by others. So in early childhood education, I think this proposes a significant change in how we see the child, how we view inclusion. So if care is dependent upon relations, then what kinds of early childhood spaces might nourish relating, might nourish intersections, incompatibilities, collisions, fluxes, interdeterminacies, and encounters with others in spaces that are intentional and careful in how we respond and relate with each other. So Bellacasa writes, quote, "This way of relating does not speak for creating unions, nor will mere juxtapositions do." End quote. She borrows from Deleuze and Parnett in writing relation as something that passes between the two, which is neither one nor the other. So similar to how Susan wrote about goo as in between, not as something that has no meaning, that's just fluid and free, but rather how this goo holds memory, this goo has a purpose. And there are decisions that need to be made in how to care for this goo in ways which honor its memory and its way of relating. So this goo is the in-between of dependent parts, parts that arrive with difference. Yet there's a danger of appropriating this goo into forms that we already know when we try to understand it. So depending on methods that presuppose its difference into the same, we have to challenge that and honor the unknowability of something that might require knowledge making that's based on care, love, and attachment that is not incompatible with conflict. So, in this way, to love something means that we are engaged in an ongoing relation that's always getting to know, that's a relationship that's always not yet, it's almost, it's on the brink of something else. So this week, I propose to you what kinds of thoughts, methods, and ways of being with children are required if care in early childhood education is to honor this ethic. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how you respond to these articles and some of these concepts this week. So that's it. Thanks, everybody.